There is a pattern I have been tracking for 3 days now, since February 20th, since Saturn met Neptune at the first degree of Aries, and the internet filled with content about spiritual awakenings and dissolved boundaries and the beginning of a new 36-year cycle. Most of that content was fine. Some of it was genuinely good. But almost none of it was based on observation. It was based on prediction. And prediction and observation are different disciplines entirely. Predictions tell you what should happen based on a model. Observations tell you what did happen based on attention. And what I observed in the 72 hours since the Saturn-Neptune conjunction perfected does not match most of the predictions I saw. Not because the predictions were wrong exactly, because they were incomplete. Here is what I noticed. Stay with me on this, because the details matter more than the headlines. In the hours after the conjunction perfected, I started receiving messages. That is not unusual for a transit of this scale. What was unusual was the content. People were not reporting mystical experiences. They were not reporting dissolution or ego death or sudden cosmic downloads. They were reporting a very specific sensation. Weight. Not heaviness in the emotional sense. Not depression. Structural weight. As if something that had been floating, undefined, unresolved, hovering in their life for months, had suddenly landed, solidified, become real in a way it had not been before. One person described it as a decision they had been avoiding for months, suddenly making itself. Not that they decided. The decision arrived. It was already made. They just noticed. They said it felt like opening a door they had been standing in front of for a year and realizing it was never locked. Another person said they woke up on February 21st and a relationship that had been ambiguous for over a year was suddenly obvious. Not better, not worse, just clear. The ambiguity evaporated, and what was left was simply what was there the entire time without the fog around it. They did not have a conversation. Nobody said anything different. The relationship did not change. Their perception of it did. A third person said a creative project they had been circling for 2 years suddenly had a structure. Not inspiration. Structure, steps, order, a sequence that would take this thing from concept to reality. They said it appeared like a blueprint unfolding. And they were confused because they expected the conjunction to bring feelings. Instead, it brought architecture. A fourth message came from someone who does not follow astrology at all. They had no idea there was a conjunction. They just said that something shifted around the 20th, and they could not explain what. They said the best way they could describe it was that the noise stopped. Not external noise, internal noise. The constant low-level static of uncertainty that they had been living with for so long, they forgot it was there. It just stopped. And in the silence, what was left was obvious. That is not dissolution. That is crystallization. And that distinction matters because crystallization is what happens when a substance transitions from disorder to order. The molecules stop floating randomly and lock into a lattice. A pattern emerges. Not because someone imposed it, because the conditions became right for the pattern that was always latent to finally express itself. The decision was already made. You just did not have the conditions to see it. The structure was already there. the fog was too thick. The conjunction cleared the fog, and the structure became visible. Let me put this in a longer context. Saturn conjuncts Neptune happens roughly every 36 years. The last one was in 1989 in Capricorn. The one before that, 1953, in Libra. And there is a pattern across all three that I have not seen laid out this way. In 1953, Saturn met Neptune in Libra, the sign of relationships and agreements. Within 18 months, the structure of international alliances shifted permanently. NATO expanded. The Korean War ended not with victory, but with a structural agreement, an armistice, a defined boundary. Relationships between nations that had been idealized became operational. The dream met the contract. And here is the detail that matters for us right now. The people living through 1953 did not experience it as awakening. They experienced it as things getting real. Relationships they thought were about shared values turned out to be about shared interests. Alliances they thought were about friendship turned out to be about geography and economics. That is Saturn-Neptune. It does not destroy, it clarifies. And clarity sometimes looks like loss, because the version you imagined was more beautiful than the version that is real. But the real version works. The imagined version never did. In 1989, Saturn met Neptune in Capricorn, the sign of structures and authority. The Berlin Wall fell within months. Most people remember '89 as dissolution. The wall dissolved. The Soviet system dissolved. But here's what most people miss. The wall did not dissolve into nothing. It dissolved into a new structure. Reunification. New borders. New treaties. The structures that replaced the wall were more complex, more real than what they replaced. The wall was built on an illusion. The structures that followed were built on reality. Messy, imperfect reality, but reality. Saturn dissolved the false structure, then immediately began building on the cleared ground. That is the pattern. Dissolve the false. Crystallize the real. Always in that order. And now, 2026, Saturn meets Neptune at 0 degrees Aries, the first degree of the entire zodiac. The Aries point, the world point, where the ecliptic crosses the celestial equator. When the sun crosses this degree each year, spring begins. It is the annual reset. But when major outer planets conjunct here, they are not marking time. They are setting it, defining what the next cycle will be organized around. The questions being asked at the 0 point are Saturn-Neptune questions. What is real? What is illusion? Where does structure end and where does dream begin? And whatever answers crystallize at this degree tend to set templates for decades. So when I say the observations from the past 72 hours matter, I mean they are early data on a pattern that will unfold over 36 years. The first hours after a conjunction are like the first minutes after concrete is poured. The shape is setting. The impressions made now harden into the template. Here is where it gets urgent. Mercury stations retrograde in 48 hours, February 25th, Pisces, 19 degrees. Mercury retrograde happens 3 times a year. It is the most overhyped transit in popular astrology. I am not going to tell you to avoid signing contracts or blame your ex texting on a planet. That is lazy astrology, and it misses the actual mechanism of what retrograde does. But this particular retrograde has a quality I have not seen before. Mercury is stationing retrograde inside the active orb of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Saturn and Neptune are still within 1 degree of exact, still radiating. The field is still hot. And Mercury, the planet that governs how you think, how you communicate, how you process information, how you translate internal knowing into external expression, is about to turn around and walk backward through that active field for 3 weeks. I want you to picture what that looks like energetically. The conjunction just built something, poured a new foundation, set a new structure in place. And now the planet of communication is going to spend 23 days walking backward through the construction site. It is not going to demolish what was built, but it is going to trip over every tool left on the ground, kick dust into every wet surface, send vibrations through every wall that is not fully dried yet. The conjunction just delivered clarity to people, decisions that made themselves, structures that appeared. Mercury retrograde in this field does not erase that clarity. The clarity is real. What arrived, arrived. But retrograde scrambles the communication of it. You know what shifted, but explaining it to someone else becomes unexpectedly difficult. The project has steps now, but when you try to write them down, the sequence comes out wrong. The relationship became clear, but when you try to talk about it, the words come out sideways. That is not confusion. That is a translation problem. The knowing is solid. The signal path is disrupted, and the gap between knowing and expressing is exactly where most people will make their biggest mistakes over the next 3 weeks. 3 things to watch between now and Tuesday. First, pay attention to the gap between what you know internally and what you can articulate externally. If you find yourself saying, "I know what I mean, but I cannot find the words," that is the conjunction retrograde interaction. Do not mistake a communication problem for a clarity problem. They are not the same thing. A lot of people are going to lose their nerve over the next few weeks. The retrograde will make them doubt the clarity they received because they cannot explain it. But inability to explain something is not evidence that the thing itself is unclear. Some things are true before they are articulable. Some structures are real before language catches up. Write it down, even if it comes out messy. The structure underneath the messy words is sound. Date what you write. You will need the timestamp later. Second, watch for premature announcements. The conjunction delivered clarity. The natural impulse is to share it. Announce the decision. Tell people about the new direction. Post about it. Start conversations about it. Mercury retrograde in this field punishes premature announcements. Not because the decision is wrong, because the words you choose during retrograde will not land the way you intend. They will be heard differently than you mean them. They will raise questions you cannot answer clearly yet. Not because you do not know the answers, but because the communication channel is not carrying the full signal. If you receive clarity around February 20th, sit with it through the retrograde. The time to communicate it is after March 20th when Mercury stations direct. There is a difference between knowing when to act and knowing when to speak. This is a period for action, not announcement. Do the work. Build the structure. Start the steps. But do not narrate the process until the channel clears. Third, watch how the crystallization sensation interacts with doubt over the next 10 days. The retrograde does not undo the landing, it tests it. Think of it like quality control. The conjunction poured the foundation. The retrograde sends vibrations through it to check for cracks. If what arrived was real, built on something solid, it survives 3 weeks of noise. The doubt will come, the confusion will arrive, and the structure will still be standing when the noise clears. But if what arrived was premature, if the clarity was actually just excitement dressed as architecture, the retrograde shows you where the foundation was not ready. Either way, you get useful information. Either way, you end up stronger by mid-March. The Romans had a festival in late February called the Terminalia, held around February 23rd, which is today, dedicated to Terminus, the god of boundaries. But the festival was not about building boundaries, it was about verifying them. Once a year, neighbors would walk their shared property lines together, not to fight, to confirm, this is where my land ends. This is where yours begins. Is the structure still accurate? Does it still hold? If a boundary had shifted, if the ground had moved, if something had changed since the last verification, the map got redrawn based on what was actually true rather than what had been agreed upon before. The Terminalia was a reality check on structures, and there is a detail most histories leave out. The verification had to be done in person. You could not send someone on your behalf. You had to walk the line yourself, stand on your own land, be present for the confirmation. Because the Romans understood that structures are not just abstract agreements. They are lived realities that require physical presence to maintain. That is exactly what Mercury retrograde inside the conjunction field is doing. Walking the boundary lines of whatever crystallized on February 20th and asking, does this hold? Is this real? And just like the Terminalia, you have to be present for it. You cannot outsource the verification to someone else's interpretation. You have to walk your own lines. The sequence matters more than any single transit. Most astrology content treats transits as isolated events. Saturn-Neptune conjunction gets a video. Mercury retrograde gets a separate video. The lunar eclipse gets its own content. But transits do not happen in isolation. They happen in sequence. And the sequence right now is extraordinary. Act 1, February 20th, the conjunction. Something crystallizes. A new structure arrives where there was fog. Act 2, February 25th, Mercury retrograde. The communication of that clarity gets tested. The Terminalia walk begins. The vibrations run through the foundation. Act 3, March 3rd, lunar eclipse in Virgo. The eclipse reveals what needs to be released, purged, cleaned for the new structure to fully land. The details that do not serve the architecture get illuminated and removed. That is not 3 events. That is one story in 3 movements. And the people who see the sequence will navigate it with attention instead of anxiety. Tomorrow I am walking you through exactly how this Mercury retrograde operates inside the conjunction field. What to do in the first 72 hours, what signals to track, and why February 25th matters more than March 3rd for what most of you are processing right now. For today, one thing. If something landed for you around February 20th, if a decision made itself, if a structure appeared, if fog cleared, write it down, on paper, in your own handwriting. Date it. Be specific about what crystallized, not what you hope it means, what it actually is. Because Mercury retrograde is going to spend 3 weeks sending static through the signal, creating noise around the clarity, making you question whether what you saw was real or whether you imagined it. And when that doubt arrives, probably around March 1st, right before the eclipse, you will want your own handwriting from the day the clarity was real. Not a screenshot, not a note in an app that disappears under notifications and grocery lists. Your hand, your ink, your words from the moment before the static started. That is not superstition. That is documentation. And documentation is how you protect structure from noise. If you want to share what crystallized, drop it in the comments. I am tracking the patterns of what this conjunction delivered, and every observation matters. That is what this channel is about. Not telling you what the stars will do to you, watching what they do, together, in real time. That is the pattern I am tracking. Stay with me on this.